Hello learners, in the previous session we had talked about the literary background of the Romantic movement. While doing so, we had discussed the first and the second generation of the Romantic poets. Today, we will be continuing with our discussion on the literary background of the Romantic movement. Now today, we will move on to talking about four things. The first being the components of the Romantic sensibility. Second, we will talk about the concept of the sublime. We will also be talking about, thirdly, Gothic subversions. Thereafter, we will talk about the novel in the Romantic age. Now, let us talk about the components of the Romantic sensibility. The first of them being imagination, emotion and intuition. You will see that for the Romantics, there is a focus on the inner workings of the individual self, such as dreams, reveries, visions and indeed the unconscious mind itself. The second component of the Romantic sensibility was a reverence for nature. Nature is the subject and object of search. Nature is also a refuge from the city. It possesses healing powers and is the dwelling place of the divine. For instance, in the pantheistic universe of Wordsworth, you will see that God is not above the human realm or transcendental, but God is immanent in nature itself. The need to find alternative forms of religion arose as Enlightenment rationalism destroyed the certainties of traditional theological beliefs. The third component of the Romantic sensibility was the cult of personality or individualism. Now, William Blake famously said, to generalize is to be an idiot, to particularize is the alone distinction of merit. General knowledges are those knowledges that idiots possess. In the Augustan period, you will see that the focus of poetry was on the outside, that is on society, whereas in the Romantic period, the focus turns inwards, that is within oneself. Now, between the Augustan sensibility and the Romantic sensibility, that is when we move from the Augustan period to the Romantic period, we notice a transition from a movement dedicated to literary rules towards a movement that was a movement of ideas. The fourth component of the Romantic sensibility was poetry as the expression of feelings and the expression of the self. Now, transformation occurred not merely at the individual level. Transformation occurred not merely at the level of theory and the practice of art, that is poetry, novels, paintings or music, but in the very manner in which art was perceived. The act of writing poetry constituted a journey which took the poet within the deeper recesses of his soul, and the art that he created as a result was to be seen as the ultimate truth. Hence, poetry for the Romantics becomes an expression of the soul and the manifestation of truth, a truth that exists within each individual self. Now, since each individual is unique and each individual has a unique imagination which is distinct to that given individual only, hence there cannot be a single Romanticism, but there exists what has been termed as Romanticisms. So, for the plural Romanticisms and on the distinction between the singular Romanticism and the plural Romanticisms, you must read A.O. Lovejoy's On the Discrimination of Romanticisms, which was published in 1924. Now, there are a few famous quotes on what constituted the Romantic sensibility. Walter Pater famously says, the addition of strangeness to beauty constitutes the Romantic character in art. He also says the essential elements then of the Romantic spirit are curiosity and the love of beauty. Yet another famous quote is that by Isaiah Berlin, the painter, the poet, the composer do not hold up a mirror to nature, however ideal, but invent. They do not imitate, but create not merely the means but the goals that they pursue. Now, let us come to the concept of the sublime. One of the key texts for understanding the sublime and its relation with the Romantic sensibility is Edmund Burke's essay, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, which was published in 1757. The text predates Romantic poetry in its study of the experience of natural phenomena, an experience that goes beyond rational understanding, inspiring passions which can neither be explained nor controlled. Now, what constitutes the sublime? The sublime can be aroused in a number of ways. However, for the Romantics, the sublime is typically an emotional product of an encounter with nature, often in solitude. This encounter often combines two contradictory states. 1. Pleasure and wonder. 2. Terror and awe. When these two contradictory states combine, the result is man's recognition of his own temporal and physical insignificance vis-a-vis the vastness of nature. When translated into poetry, the feeling and consciousness of the sublime becomes associated not merely with physical magnitude, but also with a type of intellectual, spiritual and aesthetic awakening. For instance, Shelley describes his reaction to scenery in Mont Blanc as overwhelming. Burke's theory was extremely popular and contributed to spread a passion for extreme sensations that culminated finally in the Gothic novel. Now let's talk about the tradition of the Gothic novel. First and foremost, where does the word Gothic come from? It is derived from the Goths, a nomadic Germanic tribe. It is therefore associated with both the primitive and the exotic. The word Gothic originally implied medieval, but later the emphasis changed to the macabre, the fantastic and the supernatural. We must also talk briefly here about the relationship that exists between Gothic architecture and the sublime that we just discussed. Gothic novels are typically set in wild landscapes, ruins and castles. Now, why is this feature pertaining to the setting of Gothic novels important? For the Romantics, any architecture was most appealing when it was in a state of ruin, in a state of decay. Such a state evoked an awareness and consciousness of the dead as well as a longing for the past. In this way, Gothic architecture combined the two contradictory states that we just talked about through a diagram, which is pleasure and wonder on the one hand and awe and terror on the other hand, thereby evoking a sense of the sublime. However, unlike in Burke's concept of the sublime, the terrors of Gothic fiction can be seen as a metaphorical representation of repressed unconsciousness. In particular, Gothic fiction provided an early platform for the expression of a more radical and subversive idea of sexuality. Now, let's list the major Gothic writers who emerged during this period. The first one, of course, being Horace Walpole. The history of the Gothic novel conventionally begins with the publication of Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764. It is the tale of the lord of the manor, Manfred, who is obsessed with primogeniture and the inability of his wife Hippolyta to provide him with a son. A number of Gothic modalities which reappear in later novels are in full form. Now, what are some of these modalities? We must remember that Gothic fiction tended to show victimized but often defiant women threatened with rape and incest, and so there is the conflation of villain and hero in the brooding figure of Manfred, who is given to outbursts of rage and violence and offers himself to his prospective daughter-in-law Isabella. There is also the use of confined spaces such as dungeons, castles, monasteries and prisons to symbolize extreme emotional states. Now, yet another important Gothic writer was Anne Radcliffe, who's been called the first poetess of romantic fiction by Walter Scott, the great enchantress of that generation by Thomas De Quincey, the Shakespeare of romance writers by Nathan Drake, the mighty magician of the mysteries of Udolpho by T.J. Mathias, a genius of no common stamp by Anne R. Barbol, and Mother Radcliffe by John Keats. She famously distinguished between terror, which is uncertain as well as obscure in nature in her view, and horror, which is definite as well as specific in its occurrence. For Radcliffe, terror is a feeling of anxiety, dread and shock that precedes horror, which is the actual concrete realization of having encountered a repulsive, unpleasant sight, sound or experience. For a detailed understanding of this distinction between terror and horror, please see Anne Radcliffe's On the Supernatural in Poetry, which appeared in the New Monthly magazine in the year 1826. As an example of Radcliffe's example of terror, you must also read her novel The Mysteries of Udolpho, which was published in 1794. In presenting the tale of the abducted Emily imprisoned in a gloomy castle, the novel utilizes the explained supernatural to great effect. A series of plot-based occurrences which appear to be of unexplained, irrational or supernatural origins are eventually revealed to be founded upon explicable and rational origins. The Mysteries of Udolpho established a rhetorical tradition of using an apparatus of reason to clarify the supernatural. This apparatus continued to be emulated in later Gothic and was used as a teasing device to create doubt and push the reader toward the brink of the inexplicable. This novel also led to the establishment of the genre of the female Gothic. Now, because Radcliffe was one of the founders of the female Gothic, she stands at the apex of a feminist literary consciousness that greatly impacted the novels of female writers such as Mary Shelley, Charlotte and Emily Bronte. What was the female Gothic? When the supernatural is not clarified and the novels end in mysterious ways, various essayists, critics, novelists and reviewers tended to associate the genre with horror, or more specifically the male Gothic, whereas terror was typically associated with the female Gothic. The female Gothic can be defined as a coded expression of women's fears of entrapment within the female body and within the constraints of domesticity. The female Gothic articulates women's dissatisfaction with patriarchal society and addresses the problematic position of the maternal within that society. Now, for a more comprehensive analysis of the female Gothic as a literary mode, you can read Ellen Moyer's Literary Women, which was published in 1976. This is also where the term female Gothic was first used. And for the distinction between female Gothic and male Gothic, you can see Angela Leonardi's The Function of Gender in Female and Male Gothic, a book that was published in 2017. Now, yet another important Gothic writer was Matthew Gregory Lewis. Now, one of his most famous works being The Monk, which was set in 16th century Spain, and this novel features a rapist monk and blends Catholic superstition, Faustian metaphysics, incest, murder, a castle inhabited by nuns and the Spanish Inquisition into one integral whole. Lewis was forced to withdraw the novel and edit it after a review, often attributed to Coleridge, accused him of blasphemy, a crime punishable by imprisonment. The Gothic genre was now fully established because of the kind of reception the monk received. On the public and critical reception of the novel, you can see Andrew Perrow's The Publication of The Monk, which appeared in 1960. Finally, the fourth writer who is of importance in the Gothic tradition is Mary Shelley. Now, one of the most famous novels written by Mary Shelley is Frankenstein. The novel fuses paradoxical concepts such as beauty and ugliness. The creature created by Frankenstein has a beautiful soul trapped in an ugly body. It also fuses romanticism and science, as the creature turns against its own creator once the former is out of the woods and exposed to civilization. In anticipating elements of modern horror and science fiction narrative, Frankenstein, the novel, goes beyond the structure and traditional conventions of Gothic fiction. The subversive aspects of the genre of Gothic fiction have continued to be exploited by several modern writers such as Angela Carter, Patrick McGrath and Poppy Z. Bright. Now, the question that arises here is, why the taste for the Gothic? In 1800, Marquis de Sade claimed that the novels of Lewis and Radcliffe were the necessary fruits of the revolutionary tremors felt by the whole of Europe. Sade suggests that the terrors of the French Revolution had rendered everyday reality so horrific that only the demonic and supernatural were capable of creating a greater horror in the realm of literature. It is almost as if only the horrors of the Gothic could counter the horrors of the French Revolution. Now, for a comprehensive understanding of the link that exists between Gothic fiction and the French Revolution, you may please read Ronald Paulson's Representations of Revolution, which was published by Yale University Press in 1983. Finally, let's come to the emergence of the novel in the Romantic Age. Now, the death of Sir Walter Scott in 1832 officially marks the end of the Romantic period. Who was Sir Walter Scott? He is a Scottish writer who wrote within the genre of the historical romance. His novels are set in the past with the intent of reflecting and commenting on the present. Their concerns are the rebellions, revolutions and social transformations which had occurred in Britain's history. The heroes are forced to confront and accept the changing nature of the world in which they live because it is a world shaped by forces beyond their control. The plots and characters are created in such a manner that the reader enters into the lives of not just the extraordinary heroes but also ordinary men and women caught up in dramatic and violent changes in history. Now, Scott combines a capacity for comic social observation with a romantic sense of landscape and an epic grandeur, thereby enlarging the scope of the novel in ways that were to equip it to become the dominant literary form of the later 19th century. Now, let's talk about some of the major works by Sir Walter Scott, the first being a set of Waverley novels. The first of these Waverley novels, the series was published in 1814. It was set in the Jacobite rebellion of 1745. It depicts the travails of Edward Waverley, an English gentleman who enlists himself in the army. His loyalties are split both at the political and the personal level. Eventually, he is forced to choose between the two warring sides of the uprising and the two women with whom he falls in love. Yet another novel is Rob Roy, which is set in the first Jacobite uprising of 1715. The narrator is Frank Osbaldistone, who parts from his father's family home and family business. As he travels to Scotland, he meets Robert Roy MacGregor, an actual historical figure born in the late 1600s in Scotland. Both a bandit and an outlaw, Gregor was a latter-day Robin Hood. The publication of the novel added to Gregor's fame as a folk hero. Yet another novel by Sir Walter Scott, that is Ivanhoe, depicts the 12th century struggle between the Normans and the Saxons. It presents Ivanhoe, who is a Saxon knight loyal to the Norman king, as a possible resolution to this struggle. It portrays the landscape of England in the Middle Ages as brimming with the natural beauty of valleys, forests, glades and streams, and the splendor of Norman castles. The novel was influential in reviving interest in the Middle Ages and the chivalric code of conduct. Now, to sum up what we discussed today, the session began by elaborating upon a few components of the romantic sensibility by highlighting the fact that there is no single individual unique romanticism, but there are many romanticisms and hence there cannot be a singular focus on a singular aspect. Nonetheless, the poetry of the romantics shows certain common features which we listed. Thereafter, we proceeded to understanding the vision of the romantics by introducing Edmund Burke's famous text on the sublime. Following this introduction, the components of the sublime were explained using a diagram, and finally we highlighted how and why the concept of the sublime was important not just to the romantic poets but also because it spread a passion for extreme sensations which finally culminated in the Gothic. We then discussed the tradition of the Gothic by detailing the following aspects: the term Gothic, the changing implications of the term, and finally the relationship between Gothic architecture and the sublime. Next, we addressed the question of why there emerged a taste for the Gothic. In the process, we delved into the link between Gothic subversions and the horrors of the French Revolution. Thereafter, we discussed 4 major novelists and their novels who were writing in the Gothic tradition, that is Walpole, Radcliffe, Lewis and Mary Shelley. Finally, we discussed the novel in the Romantic age by mentioning the figure of Sir Walter Scott, his 3 famous novels and his early contribution to the then emerging genre of the novel, which was to become the dominant literary genre later in the 19th century. So this is all for today's session, my dear learners. I hope you enjoyed what we talked about today. Thank you for listening.